This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Okay, so I'm a lone anthropologist here, and this is a very new project for me. So this is the first time I'm actually thinking on paper, and I'm actually going to read. I don't trust myself to talk freely about this. As you see, no PowerPoint. Just a few words about myself. My old project in anthropology was about Milosevic's Serbia. I sold myself as a political anthropologist, and now I'm switching to something completely different, namely to some kind of combination of anthropology of art and anthropology of science. Basically, I try to understand what happens when you get neuroscientists and artists in the same room and expect great revelations. And my experience of such events so far is that you mostly get a dialogue of the deaf, but a lot of mutual infatuation. And also an elephant in the room, namely because most participants seem not to be aware of their misunderstandings. So I'm a student of misunderstandings, and you can say that that's what anthropology is all about, because if there were no intercultural misunderstandings, there would be no need for anthropologists, therefore there would be no anthropologists. So maybe this is my bias. I tend to see the abstract problems of reduction as relations among different academic disciplines. And I love that Eleanor Taylor, who on the first day talked about good friends and bad friends among disciplines. This is the kind of way I think. In any case, I have pretty serious background in clinical psychology. I'm learning as much sociology, history, and philosophy of science as I can. I'm taking neuroscience courses, and I hope to do a classical lab ethnography of a couple of neuroscience labs. I'm also getting to know artists, art historians, and philosophers of art on the other side. Maybe I should try this. Okay. And I'm preparing to acquire the expertise I need to understand why this dialogue of sea, peace, knows two cultures mostly doesn't work, and why it does work when it does. So we anthropologists like to say about ourselves that we're jacks of all trades and masters of none. But we do claim a special acrobatic skill in jumping in and out of different worlds. Sometimes we can do it with different disciplines that we, of course, like to treat as tribes. We tend to be good switchboard operators among the disciplines. So I will also try to bring to you another type of expertise that we claim, that expertise about animisms of the world, or how different people endow things with minds and make minds into things. Something I hope could be relevant to mind-brain reductionism debates. I've discerned a kind of swing in these debates, a journey inside that alternates with the journey outside. I'm talking about the classical mind-brain reductionist on the one hand, the proponents of the extended mind on the other. Now, anthropologists have been externalists for quite some time, and some have recently embarked on a very ambitious project of radically disturbing our modern sense of where to draw boundaries between humans and non-humans. I think that these two movements have a lot in common and should start a conversation. So let me start with the elephant in the room that alerted me to the issue of reductionism and ultimately brought me here. The room was the hall of Columbia University Italian Academy for Advanced Studies, where in 2006, leading world neuroscientists met with a stellar lineup of artists to talk about art and the new biology of mind. The artists including Marina Abramovic, Laurie Anderson, Robert Irvin, and so on. The neuroscience lineup featured Eric Kandel, Antonio Damasio, Vittorio Gallese, Joseph Ledoux, Semir Zeki, Villeneuve Ramachandran, and Margaret Livingstone. It's a who is who in neuroscience. The event was hosted by David Friedberg, one of the rare neuroscience enthusiasts among his tribe of art historians. So it was Eric Kandel who made reductionism the centerpiece of his talk, claiming that reductionism is something scientists and artists actually share. So how does he do that? He gave several examples, most notably about Rothko's journey from figuration in his 1930s work to increased abstraction in the 1950s. Now, Kandel says that this progressive stripping away of overt references to recognizable imagery is reductionism, and happily proclaims Rothko a fellow reductionist. Now, Kandel is famous for making his discoveries about memory on a giant marine snail, the famous Aplysia, which only has about 20,000 neurons, which of course greatly simplifies examining its neural circuitry. Kandel is very happy to call himself a radical reductionist in that sense. So, standing in front of classical Rothko painting, Kandel says with a flourish, and I said to myself, you think you are a reductionist, look what this guy is doing. And the audience burst into laughter. But that, I'd say, is utterly wrong. To say that studying a simple organism before you advance to more complex ones is analogous to what artists do when they go from figuration to abstraction is to exhibit extremely sloppy thinking. But you're a Nobel Prize winner, I guess you're allowed to do these things. Perhaps the central irony of the conference was that the premier philosopher of art, Arthur Danta, was thrust in the role of a moderator, a role that left him decidedly uncomfortable. After all, Danta built his entire career on what makes Warhol's Brillo boxes art. And the whole point is that there is little perceptual difference between the real Brillo boxes in the store and Warhol's, yet only the latter are considered art. Now, Laurie Anderson put it most succinctly, I think. She said, the amygdala does this and that, it lights up there in our brains. Well, that may well describe my reaction to cherry pie, not just my work. That is to say, you need the entire art world context to talk about modern art today. It is not really about perceptual qualities. Okay, so where do I, as an anthropologist, fit in all this? Well, in her neurophilosophy, Patricia Churchland actually calls on anthropologists and their services, so I'm going to quote. The important thing for getting at the truth about brains, she writes, is not whether in customary usage ordinary humans in the street do say that persons remember, but do not say that brains remember. Rather, it is whether we ought to say that brains remember. Whether giving the empirical facts, it is a reasonable hypothesis that brain remember. Customary usage is perhaps of anthropological interest, but it will not determine much about the nature of reality. Well, customary usage of folk psychology has, for Churchland, essentially the same epistemological status as various assorted mythologies of humankind. And I'm quoting again. Lurching out from the comfortable cave that is our common sense conception of things, human brains have come to represent the sun not as a god driven about in a golden chariot, but as a nuclear fire, and the earth not as a sheet with fat-cheeked cherubs blowing from the four corners, but as a ball hurtling about the sun, and the heart not as a cauldron for concocting animal spirits, but as a pump for blood. We want also to understand our brains, and thus the brain investigates the brain, and burdened no doubt with the pack of misconceptions, not unlike those impeding the investigation of the sun or the heart, but empowered for all that to disemburden itself and to bootstrap its way to insight and understanding. Fair enough. Yes, it's indeed the anthropologists and scholars of myth who, in the current division of academic labor, have the task of studying this pack of misconceptions. Although from her perspective, it's unclear why anyone should bother anyway except for quaint antiquarian purposes. But let me, as a thought experiment, turn the tables and see how neurophilosophy arguments appear to us antiquarians. First, I see there is a direction to what I will call the ghost-busting expedition to the interior. Note the movement is from outside to inside. Gods are withdrawn from sun and earth, then animal spirits from blood and internal organs, in a progression in which one internal organ, brain, aided by its own product called science, will finally disemburden itself from all the phantoms, ghosts, and demons it used to project into itself in its own folk psychology mode. Now, this movement from external to internal anthropomorphizing is what interests mythologists, a scholar of mythology, Gregory Schrempp from Indiana University, in his analysis of homunculism in artificial intelligence and neuroscience writing. The chapter in his book is called Descartes Descending, or The Last Homunculus, Introversive Anthropomorphizing in Popular Science Writing. This will be then my entry into this mind-brain reductionism debate. My hunch is that the tug-of-war among various positions could profitably be seen as a tug between those who march inwards, busting the ghosts in the machine in a sort of fantastic journey inside the brain, and those who want to extend the mental beyond brain into the body and further away into the world. One is a deanimating march to the interior, the other a reanimating march beyond individual skin and out into the world. Both the inner and the outer journeys seem to share a certain logical compulsion. Once you start inwards, you seem compelled to follow the infinite regress to its bitter end. And on the rebound, once you start the journey out, you're compelled not to stop until you progress far beyond the skin. So let's get into this homunculus business. I hope I wanted to have a good picture, but I couldn't find one. Homunculism is, of course, regarded as a fallacy in neuroscience and artificial intelligence. It consists of purporting to account for intelligent behavior merely by referring it to inner beings or agencies that possess the capacity that is to be explained. An inner little man that intelligently reads inputs and decides on intelligent courses of action. And homunculism is supposed to be prone to infinite regress and is often seen as a part of folk psychology. Dennett, who Schrempp takes as his representative for homunculism, famously suggests that since we cannot easily get rid of this tendency, we can stop the infinite regress and turn the fallacy to our advantage by making little men in the brain progressively more stupid, until we arrive at homunculi so stupid they could be replaced by a machine. Or a simple neuromechanism that, for instance, has only to remember to say yes or no when asked. That's what Dennett says. One discharges fancy homunculi from one's scheme by organizing armies of such idiots to do the work. Now, Schrempp sees homunculism as an interesting twist in this inward march of de-anthropomorphizing from stars to minds. Because at the border of the skin, as you enter the skull, you mythologize as a first step to demythologize. So he says, little pantheons of homunculi offer a roundabout way of saying that the mind is like a physical cosmos, which was once also thought of in terms of pantheons. All that remains is the replacement of these personalized understandings with depersonalized ones. Now, this inward march of ghost busting that posits mythological little men only as a pretext of getting rid of their little minds may not be as easy as it seems. For one, these homunculi seem to be organized into societies of sorts, like armies of idiots, right? While gods of external mythology tended to live in kinship-based societies, the brain and computer homunculi are organized like modern bureaucracies. And there is a small literature out there about how this brain talk imports and naturalizes neoliberal ideology, but I'm not going to go there. As homunculi become stupider, their society seems to increase in complexity. Now, one danger is that the mind mystery stuff might be surreptitiously smuggled in through the image of society, taking advantage of our tendency to unthinkingly presume social interactional skills of any positive homunculi. This is Schrempp. And going back to the sense of a homunculus who remembers to say yes or no when asked, that presupposes a lot. Understanding questions, for instance, right? So such skills are being especially easy to slip under the radar, since in ordinary life, such skills are largely unconscious and tacit. Okay, so there seems to be a logic in the system that drives this progressive extermination of ghosts, where they're chased from the skies into the brain molecules. And the march is driven by philosophers trying to catch each other at smuggling in intentionality, intelligence, purpose, mind, etc., into what is supposedly merely another machine. It may work by positing a preliminary mythology of homuncular bureaucracy, who are then progressively divested of their mental properties until we arrive at what Dennett, in Sweet Dreams, considers a good theory of consciousness, namely the one that should make a conscious mind look like an abandoned factory, full of humming machinery and nobody home to supervise it or enjoy it or witness it. But these ghosts are cunning masters of metamorphosis. Instead of disappearing before the march of triumphant eliminative materialism, they just find another way to smuggle themselves into the matter. The optimistic view, of course, is that homunculi are mainly a whimsy and an entertaining stand-ins for black boxes that the march of science and our computational powers will eventually fill with ghostless machinery. Now, some may argue that the computational powers required would actually be that of a Laplacian demons, and thus, on practical grounds, unattainable for limited beings that we are, as William Wimsatt would say. There are other arguments, however, that say that even if we possess the computational powers of Laplacian demons, the products of such calculations will still be meaningless and will have to depend on their intelligibility on the smuggling in of intentionality, agency, and all that mental stuff. In Raymond Tallis's pithy chiasmus, we would still have to personify the brain in order to brainify the person. Okay, one such argument is that advanced by Michael Polanyi, who in fact starts out by denying intelligibility to Laplacian ideal of totally explicit knowledge. This is a little personal note, I learned to think with Michael Polanyi when he offered me the keys to what was wrong with academic psychology I was studying in Belgrade in the 1980s. Now he's falling through the cracks for what I now think are sociological reasons. Too radical for the conservatives, too conservative for the radicals at the time of the Kuhnian paradigm shift. Too philosophical for scientists perhaps, and not philosophically rigorous enough for philosophers. Maybe he fell in the gap between continental and analytic philosophy as well. But I still think that he has cleared some ground in a way much more useful than Merleau-Ponty, Ryle, or Heidegger. So let me breathlessly try to summarize what I need from Polanyi. We attend from clues or particulars to something on which these particulars jointly bear. All knowing necessarily involves acts of tacit integration of these subsidiary clues into what we attend to focally. We are not aware in the same way of what we attend from and what we attend to. Just like foreground and background. We may switch between them, but we perceive them differently. And he does draw a lot from Gestalt psychology here. The moment we shift our focal attention to the subsidiary clues we relied upon to attend focally to something else, that something else disappears or loses its meaning. Think of what happens when you shift your focal attention to single images that together form a stereoscopic image, the view masters. Or what happens when you focus on what your fingers do on a keyboard, or when you try to attend to the letters or sounds in themselves. Depth of image disappears, our skill disintegrates, words become meaningless. Now, our bodies are a paradigmatic set of things that we attend from in order to perceive something else. Therefore, all subsidiary awareness of things has the character of indwelling in them the way we dwell in our bodies. We endow a thing with meaning by interiorizing it. In other words, we extend ourselves into tools we use to attend to the world in the widest sense of the term. Not just the blind person's stick that becomes a part of the body, but also language, culture, and science itself. We dwell in our bodies to attend from them to the world that we perceive. We dwell in parts of comprehensive entities in order to attend to the meaning of the whole. We experience a man's mind as the joint meaning of his actions by dwelling in his actions from the outside. Therefore, the mind is the meaning of the body in that sense. Mind then is not a substance, but a particular way of attending. And so is the brain. When we look at the brain, the mind disappears. The neurologist cannot dwell in those bodily events, Polanyi says, as he could in the subject's physiognomy or intelligent behavior. And yet, in order to make those bits of brain behavior at all meaningful, the neurologist has to smuggle in his ordinary tacit grasp of what the human person whose brain is being observed is up to. This tacit grasp has to remain in the background of this way of attending to the brain. This background cannot be eliminated. Instead, it haunts the bits of brain under scrutiny as smuggled mind. Or, if you eliminate the context, it comes back to haunt you. All right, William Wimsatt offers an account of reductionism that, while different from Polanyi's, may be useful to introduce here. Scientists typically start by partitioning the world of study into the system they designated and its environment. And reductionist strategy usually means that the scientist is primarily interested in the entities and relations internal to the system of study. which often leads to simplify the environment much more severely than the system he or she is studying. It will then frequently happen that the properties of the system scientists study are assumed to be independent of context, when in fact they're disguised relational properties. In some cases, such reductionist heuristics leads to errors that are relatively benign and easily correctable. In some cases, where boundaries are fuzzy and levels are hard to determine, we end up with what Wimsatt calls thickets. Thickets, jungles. The neurophysiological, psychological, and social realms, he says, are mostly thickets, which are only occasionally well ordered enough for local problems to be treated as perspectival or level relative problems. And he has a whole technical discussion of what is perspective and level. All of this enormously complicates talk of reduction, because with such multiply connected entities and the failure of the ability to say what is composed of what, it may now be almost impossible to determine what is being reduced, what is doing the reducing, what is even the proper scope of the system under analysis, and the problem we're asked to solve. All right, so can we then say that in such thickets, internal properties of a system too narrowly delineated are in some sense haunted by those smuggled relational properties? In other words, are Wimsatt's thickets of such a nature that any localization of the system that is too narrow by necessity produces ghosts? And what if collapsing the mind into the brain is to localize too narrowly? In that case, no ghost busting will chase the ghosts away. If this is the case, maybe it is time to give up and expand the scope of the system under analysis. If it's not brain, then what is it? My hunch is that the crux of the problem has to do with the localization or spatialization of the mind. If to objectify the mind is to stuff it into the brain, that is to say localize in the brain, and if that specialization within the brain turns out to be highly problematic, then what holds us from questioning the initial collapsing of the mind into the brain? And that's exactly what the move that T. Rockwell, who by the way is inspired by Dewey and pragmatism, makes in his book called Neither Brain Nor Ghost. And it is in fact our very homunculus Dennett who puts this reversal into motion. So, Rockwell starts by quoting Dennett. Wherever there is a conscious mind, there is a point of view, says Dennett. What happens, though, when we close in on the observer, what happens? When we close in on the observer and try to locate the observer's point of view more precisely as a point within the individual, the simpler assumptions that work so well on larger scales begin to break down, says Dennett. So, Rockwell says, well, there is no way that those of us who agree with Dennett on this point can avoid several other conclusions. Dennett's point is that there is no reason to assume that this model will work once we get inside the brain. But there's also no reason to assume that it will work inside the skin, or that there is a constant and unchanging line between where it works and where it doesn't work. At any given time, there is a region within which everything is ready to hand for me and thus not observable. Note this is a Heideggerian term for which I think we can easily substitute Polanyi. And this region, I maintain, is me in the most unambiguous sense possible. The pattern of activity that occurs within that region is primarily what embodies me. It includes, but is not limited to, the activity in my brain and body. When I observe something or relate to it in any other way, it becomes part of that region of activity, and thus, in a non-trivial sense, part of me. As a poetic metaphor, this statement is almost common sense. But the arguments that Dennett and I have put forth against Cartesian materialism create a slippery slope that disposes of any reason to avoid taking it literally. I like this image of slippery slope. I've been building towards it. It seems they operate in two different opposite directions. One is the slippery slope that once you have stuffed the mind into the brain urges you to go on down the slippery path of positing some sort of homunculi or black boxes and then trying to purge them from their mentalistic goats. At the end, you arrive at the impossibility of dispensing with one or another of magic tricks of smuggling the mind into the matter. If you then reverse your direction, you're embarking on another reverse slippery slope that leads from the brain into the world. So we are in the company of extended mind philosophers. They are systematically, painstakingly crawling out of the hole created by collapsing the mind into the brain. And they extend it first to the entire nervous system, then to the body, then finally beyond the skin into the world. It is hard work because people like Andy Clark, Ted Rockwell, Alva Noe, Richard Menari, Mark Rowlands, etc., have to fight every inch of the way against their philosophical opposition. Indeed, it seems highly counterintuitive, at least to our modern way of thinking, to see anything outside of our skin as embodying mind, cognition, or consciousness. It smacks of animism, fetishism, vitalism, in a word, mysticism, magic, and mythology. This is where we anthropologists can offer an alliance to extended mind philosophy. The notion that in some very strong way we do not stop at our skin has been current for quite some time in anthropology. Polanyi embraced it with his notion of personal knowledge, as did Gregory Bateson, another intellectual hero of mine, and his quite explicit extension of mind way beyond human skin. Both have, coincidentally, used the image of the blind man with the stick to make the point of how we extend ourselves into our tools and out into the world. And actually, I'm going to skip Bateson, but basically the question seems to be how large the system you cut out for study. And the answer is just large enough for each situation so that you don't have to smuggle any ghosts, as leaving things inexplicable tends to produce them. But it's not simple in the real world. In the real world, it comes to delineating the scope of the problem. We get into political struggle amongst the established disciplines, since they tend to be organized in the way we think the universe is cut up. Okay, so back to Wimsatt. So he says, okay, claims may be made that phenomena at any given level are to be viewed from a given perspective, and any level of analysis or perspective that has successful associated theories will attempt to claim disputed territory. But that is just the point. There will be a lot of disputed territory, and the disputes will often turn on how the system is to be cut up for analysis. In such struggles, Wimsatt warns, you'd better get an overall sense of geography before you decide on your colonizing strategy. This is a lesson as well of which eliminativists should beware. You don't make friends with the natives, in parentheses folk, by denying their legitimacy, psychology. And you can't tell what's in the territory without a native guide. You can play imperialist without heeding these warnings, but it usually requires more resources, costs a lot more, and takes a lot longer. And you may end up having to grant them autonomy anyway. So who are the native guides here? I claim that we should perhaps enlist the anthropologist. And my starting hunch was that philosophical debates about mind-brain reductionism are in some way a variation on the theme of ensouling and desouling that is very familiar to anthropologists, since animism, fetishism, and similar strategies of reifying minds and mindifying things are our specialty. There is now a concerted effort to classify all such ways of delineating the beings of the world. Viveiros de Castro, Philippe Descola, Tim Ingold, Bruno Latour have been working independently and together on developing such schemes. For instance, Descola develops a fourfold schema of cosmologies or ontologies: animism, naturalism, totemism, and analogy. And I wish I had time to go into this. Our cosmology, naturalism, is only one of them. And the thrust of these efforts, most of them works of stunning erudition and ambition, is to seriously destabilize our modern naturalist ontology and epistemology. And a lot of that destabilization has to do with extending the mind or the person beyond the skin, where various non-humans become components of distributed persons. And I wish I could go more into distributed persons, but I'm just thinking that these ants that were eating the documents are actually non-humans that are part of what's going on in society. So what are Descola and others really saying? That we should give up our naturalist ontology, that we should become animists or totemists? Well, Descola himself confesses or warns that anthropologists are as thorough naturalists and for all our pieties no less condescending towards all these ethnosciences that we find in the Amazon. Well, here is my stab at last-minute thinking. I noticed that there's a lot of anguish in this room about ontology as opposed to mere epistemology of reductionism and emergence. My question is pragmatic. We heard here that scientists, even physicists who seem most worried about ontology, are in practice quite relaxed about what is really real or what actually constitutes the furniture of the world. The question is, what is the practical significance of holding to one or the other version of ontology? Are you more likely to pursue certain venues of inquiry and ask certain questions in certain ways if you believe in one kind of furniture as opposed to another? Now, I've seen warnings that our modern ontology is in fact misleading or detrimental or even pernicious, perhaps, for science. On the other hand, we can hardly disagree that it is this modern ontology, modern naturalism, that, together with all kinds of other things, spurred the development of science as we know it. Well, could it be that what initially enabled science is now shackling it? This is a Marxist analogy. Or maybe we should use our neighbor in direct vicinity of this place, Max Weber. Protestant ethic and its weird psychological dilemmas produced in a convoluted way, together with other things, the spirit of modern capitalism. But once established, capitalism no longer needs any religious ethics and is compatible with others, let's say Confucian ethic. So with science. It may have been initialized by our naturalist ontology, but it may no longer depend on it. Is science now compatible with different ontologies? To answer that question, I submit, it may be useful to construct a map of all the ontologies that human beings have actually espoused as a way to organize their world. Ontologies in the sense of schemas, quite limited in number, for, I'm quoting Descola, distributing resemblances and differences between existing entities and for establishing between the groups defined by that distribution and within them distinctive relations of a remarkable stability. Okay, I'm ending this. Okay. So it is our ontology that produces this compulsive swing between naturalist monism and radical relativism. Everything is nature, matter, physical. Everything is cultural construction. That may play itself as the kind of journey inside or outside our skulls. So let me throw a few provocations. What if all ontologies are folk ontologies? Meaning you cannot derive ontology from science. Science is a product of one of these, the modern naturalism that is about 300 years old. But science may be underdetermined by it and may not itself produce ontology. Most people, through most of the history, espouse different ones, and this is a massive social fact. Maybe ours is producing more anomalies than it can deal with. Maybe we're in flatland and need to jump out to higher dimensions. Anthropologists, I mentioned, Descola, Latour, etc., are not claiming they have a new ontology for us. They're just preparing the terrain for future diplomatic talks by providing a larger map. This is what I wanted to gesture towards. Thank you.